Today we're going to be sewing the Ruffle Brunch set by Matchy Matchy Sewing Club. This video is a tutorial that's meant to accompany the written instructions, and there's links to the pattern in the description as well as more information for fabric requirements, garment measurements, and timestamps for each step. The Ruffle Brunch set is a really fun and cute make. It's a top and a bottom separate so that you can either wear together or you can mix and match them. The top is a little bit more fitted. It has princess seams that go up and down vertically, and as well as a scooped neckline, puff sleeves that are finished with a really sweet ruffle, and then a ruffle along the bottom of the top. View A is finished with ties, and then View B has a button placket. And we also have this top with graded as an AB cup and a CD cup. So the CD cup includes 1.5 inches extra in the bust area, as well as a little bit more shaping for a larger bust. And the pattern also comes with elastic waist pants that have anchored pockets to the waistband, and they're finished with a ruffle at the bottom, as well as a shorts view that are the same as the pants, but they are a short length. Now it's time to cut out all your pattern pieces, mark them with the labels that are included in your pattern, and let's get sewing. Start by stitching 1/4 inch along the necklines of the front and back bodice. Because the neckline's cut on a curve, stay stitching helps to prevent the neckline from stretching or warping during sewing. With the right sides together, pin the bodice side panel to the bodice center panel, matching at the notch. It helps to pin or clip at the notch first, and then pin from the top and the bottom, as you're going to have to ease in this seam a little bit. Sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then finish your seam with a zigzag stitch or serger. You will then press the seam toward the side panel and repeat these steps for the other side of the bodice. To prepare the button placket for View B, you're going to cut 2 pieces of fusible interfacing that are 1 inch wide by the length of your center front panel. We happen to have interfacing on a spool, but you can also cut it from a larger piece of interfacing. Then on both the left and the right fronts, on the wrong side of the fabric, apply your fusible interfacing 1/2 inch away from the center front and stopping at the notches. Go ahead and press that fusible interfacing onto the wrong side of your fabric, and then you're going to fold the center front 1/2 inch towards the wrong side, using the edge of that interfacing as your guide. Then you will fold over again by another inch towards the wrong side, covering up the interfacing and pressing that in place. And you can use your notches as a guide for this. Once that's pressed down nicely, you can pin in place, and we will sew with an edge stitch about 1/8 of an inch away from the folded edge to secure that button placket. And you will repeat all these steps for the other side of the front panel. Now we will attach the shoulder seams. So with the right sides touching, you will align your front and your back bodices at the shoulder seams and pin them in place. Then we're going to sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and finish those seams with a zigzag stitch or a serger, and we will press them toward the back bodice. With your right sides together, pin the front and back side seams, and you will sew them with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Finish your seams with a zigzag stitch or serger, and go ahead and press your seams toward the back. Now we're going to prepare and attach our sleeve. We'll sew 2 rows of basting stitches between the outer notches on our sleeve. You'll want to use the longest stitch length on your machine and pull the tails of your basting stitches so they're a few inches long. Make sure not to backstitch on the beginning or the end of these stitches. It's also helpful to use a different color bobbin thread if you're new to gathering, so you can see the threads a little bit better. Now we will sew up our side seam on our sleeve. So you'll fold your sleeve in half with the right sides touching and pin the shortest edge, making sure that your basting stitches are out of the way because we don't want to sew over them. And then we'll sew that seam with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and again finish it with a zigzag stitch or a serger. And then you will press your sleeve seam toward the back of the sleeve. Now, to gather your sleeve, you are going to flip it to the side with the bobbin threads, and you will pull only the bobbin threads, so those 2 pink threads that you're seeing on the wrong side of the fabric right now, and you're going to gently distribute the fabric as you pull. And you can start from one side, gather it to the center notch, and then gather the other side. Now, to attach the sleeves to the bodice, with the right sides touching, you will insert your sleeve into the bodice and the sleeve opening, and you will pin it together starting with the underarm seam. And then you will pin your shoulder seam to the center notch on your sleeve, and then go ahead and distribute your gathers evenly using the notches at the front and the back of the sleeve head. And then make sure your gathers are distributed nice and evenly. You can either pull them a little tighter or loosen them depending on how much space you have. You can go slowly during this part and use as many pins or clips as you need to secure your gathers. Now we're going to sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Sew with the gather side up, making sure that your stitch line is in between those 2 basting stitch lines that we created earlier to gather the sleeve. And you can gently rearrange your gathers during this step while you're sewing to make sure that they stay even. And finish this seam with a zigzag stitch or serger. Now we're going to press the seam allowance toward the bodice. And you will repeat all these steps for the other sleeve as well. Now we'll prepare the baby hem on our sleeve ruffle. So with the right sides together, sew the short ends of the sleeve ruffle with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, creating a loop. You'll finish this seam with a zigzag stitch or serger and then press it to one side. Now we are going to fold the edge toward the wrong side of the fabric and press it, and your fold will be 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter. Now we're going to sew with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance along the folded edge, pretty much as close to that folded edge as you can get. Go slowly during this part and keep moving your loop so that your machine can sew smoothly. Remember to backstitch at the end. And you can see that stitch line is really close to the bottom of this folded edge. We are now going to use that stitch line as a guide and trim off as much excess fabric as we can, as close to that stitch line as possible. you can toss away that extra fabric that you just trimmed, and now we are going to use that stitch line that we made as a guide and press it up again. Then we're going to sew with another 1/8 of an inch seam allowance really close to that edge so that we can get this really tiny sweet baby hem on our sleeve ruffle, and this also reduces bulk so your ruffle will fall really nicely. So go ahead and sew all the way around the bottom of that ruffle and backstitch. Now we're going to attach the sleeve ruffle. So with the right sides together, align the raw edge of the sleeve ruffle with the raw edge of the sleeve and pin in place. Now we will sew with a 1-inch seam allowance along the entire raw edge of the sleeve. This is the only time we are going to use a 1-inch seam allowance, and this is to create a channel for our elastic. Flip your garment so the wrong side is out. Now we're going to trim away the excess seam allowance on the sleeve seam only. That is the ruffle seam allowance. This is the sleeve seam allowance, and we want to make sure that we fold our ruffle seam allowance out of the way so that we're not trimming it. We're only trimming the sleeve seam. Go ahead and trim that down to 1/4 of an inch all the way around the edge. Now you can see that the ruffle seam allowance is poking out, and we are going to fold that over 1/4 of an inch to match the edge of our trimmed seam allowance and press it in place. Next, we will press both seam allowances toward the sleeve. The sleeve ruffle will naturally want to flip and now hang towards the sleeve opening, enclosing all the seam allowances to form an elastic casing. Go ahead and press this seam allowance up all the way around your sleeve and pin in place. As you are pinning, make sure to leave a 1-inch opening to insert the elastic, usually right next to the sleeve seam. Sew the opening closed with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance from the folded edge. Making sure to leave that 1-inch opening for your elastic to thread through. This is the opening that we will put our elastic in. To measure your elastic, just wrap it around your arm loosely with a few inches of ease so that it's not too tight, and cut. You will need 2 pieces of elastic this length, one for each sleeve. We like to mark each end of our elastic with a colored pen so that when we thread it through and it meets up at the end, if both blue dots are meeting up, we know that it's not twisted. So go ahead and attach a safety pin to one end of your elastic and thread it through the casing, being careful not to twist it. Once it's threaded through and your blue marks match up, you can overlap your elastic by about 1/2 inch. Pin it together and sew on your machine using several back stitches to secure it. Go ahead and evenly distribute your elastic around your sleeve cuff and sew that opening closed. You will repeat all these steps for your other sleeve, and now you have your finished sleeves that are attached to your bodice. Let's prepare our bodice ruffle. So we have a left front ruffle and a right front ruffle. We are going to sew the short ends of these ruffles together with the right sides touching. Making sure that your right sides are together and that any directional prints are going the same direction. And now we are going to sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance on both of those seams. Making sure that you are backstitching at the beginning and the end. And then we will finish those seams with a zigzag stitch or a serger, and then go ahead and press the seams toward this back ruffle. So now you have this really long, skinny ruffle piece. We are gonna, again, do a baby hem. There is a notch at the top center, and make sure that you are doing it on the opposite side of the notch. You'll fold up that edge 3/8 of an inch. Sew with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance really close to the edge. Trim off that seam allowance. Press up that folded edge again, and then sew with another 1/8 inch seam allowance, creating a really cute baby hem. This is also called a rolled hem, and some sewing machines do include a rolled hem foot, so you can use that if that's your preference as well. For view B, which is the button placket view, you can continue along. We are going to fold the short ends of our bottom ruffle a 1/4 inch towards the wrong side of the fabric and press, and then fold another 1/4 inch and press. Then you will sew this with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance on the folded edge, and repeat the same step for the opposite end of your ruffle. Now you have the finished edge of your bodice ruffle. Now we will go ahead and gather our bottom ruffle. You're going to want to sew 2 rows of basting stitches just like we did for our sleeve, making sure to stop and start at every seam so that your gathering is smooth. Remember not to backstitch at any of these seams, simply pull and then leave a long tail on your gathering stitches. You'll sew your first row at a 1/4 of an inch away from the edge, and your second row at 5/8 inch away from your edge. You can see we have 3 sets of basting stitches for your gathers. Now you can use your basting stitches to pull and gather each section, making sure that your gathers are distributed evenly. You can go slowly on this part as this is quite a long ruffle and it can take a while to distribute those gathers. You don't want to pull too hard and break your basting stitches. It's also helpful to press your gathers to keep them in place a little bit better, especially on this shorter ruffle that tends to curl up. You can always redistribute them as you're attaching it to the bodice. You'll want to match with the right sides together using your center notch and your side seams. Go ahead and pin in place at your seams, keeping your basting stitches out of the way. Then once everything is pinned at the notches and the seams, you can go ahead and distribute your gathers evenly. Because we pressed the gathers, they are a little bit easier to distribute now, so they don't have to be perfectly distributed when you're pinning. And go ahead and pin everything in place along the entire bottom of your bodice. And now we will sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance right in between those 2 basting stitches that we created for the gathers. You'll want to sew with the gathered side up to make sure you're staying within those lines and that all your gathers are going to lay down nicely. Then we will finish that edge with a zigzag stitch or a serger, and we will press the seam allowance up towards the bodice. Now we will sew that seam allowance toward the bodice with 1/4 inch, making sure to catch all the seam allowances so it's nice and neat. And now you have a bodice ruffle. For view A of the pattern, we're now going to make the ties. If you're making view B, skip ahead. To form a crease in your tie, you're going to fold your tie in half lengthwise with the wrong sides together and press it in place and then open it back up. This creates a nice crease for us later on. Now you're going to fold one short end 1/4 inch towards the wrong side of the fabric and press it in place. Next, fold the top and bottom edges towards the wrong side to meet at the center crease and press it in place. Pressing here will really help you to create a nice, neat tie. Now you're going to fold your tie in half using that crease mark at the center and press it in place. Then we're going to edge stitch along that double folded end and do it as close to the bottom as you can. Make sure to back stitch as well. Then when you get to the bottom of the short end, you're going to lift up your foot with your needle down and pivot so that we can sew an edge stitch along that bottom to close up our tie. It's helpful to use a piece of paper to stabilize your tie, and you can just place it underneath the end of your tie so it doesn't get sucked in by the feed dogs. Then when you're done, you can just tear off that piece of paper that you used to stabilize. And you will repeat this for all of your ties. Make sure to give them a good press at the end. Now let's attach your ties to the bodice. You are going to fold the front opening 3/8 of an inch towards the wrong side and press it in place. Then go ahead and fold by another 3/8 of an inch and press again. Do the same thing with the other side of the bodice opening. Then, using the notches on your pattern, you are going to tuck the raw edge of the ties under the folded flap and pin in place. So there will be 3 ties on the left side of your bodice and 3 ties on the right side of your bodice. Make sure you are putting the edge stitched edge on the long side of your tie towards the bottom. And then we're going to edge stitch along that folded flap, making sure the ties are out of the way. This will secure your ties to your bodice. Now you are going to fold your ties away from the bodice and pin or clip them in place so that they're secured. And then you're going to flip it to the right side and go ahead and just tack them down with a few stitches so that they stay in place and that they are facing the correct direction. Remember to backstitch a few times. And now you have a bodice front with all of your ties. Now we will prepare and attach our neck bias binding. We are going to fold and press the bias tape lengthwise in thirds toward the wrong side. It's helpful to pre-curve your bias tape and press it a little bit so that it will naturally want to follow the curve of your neckline. Then you'll unfold the bias tape to create crease lines or press lines that we will use as guides while we're sewing later. With the right sides together, you're going to place your bias tape and the edge of your neckline together. And you want to extend your bias tape 1/2 inch from the end of your neckline and fold it back on itself to the wrong side of the neckline opening, creating an extension. Pin that extension in place. Then continue to pin around the neckline, being careful not to stretch your bias tape too much. When you reach the end, trim your bias tape so that it extends another 1/2 inch past the end of the neckline. Then we're going to fold this extension back onto the wrong side of the neck opening and pin in place. Once everything is secured and pinned, we are going to sew using the top line that's closest to the neckline as our guide, which is about 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Make sure to backstitch at the beginning and end of these stitches. And we will sew along the entire neckline opening. Go slowly, and again, make sure not to pull or stretch your bias tape too much. Just let it naturally fall where it wants to. Once you get to the end where the extension is, you will just sew over it like normal, securing the side that is tucked onto the wrong side of the neckline. Next, we are going to press the bias tape and the seam allowance up and away from the neckline. The extension pieces will naturally want to flip upwards, and it'll cover the raw edge of the neckline opening. So you will press these seam allowances and the bias tape up along the entire edge of the neckline. And we want to understitch the seam allowance to the bias tape with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance away from that seam. So understitch along the entire opening of your neckline, making sure to catch the bias tape and the seam allowance underneath. This creates a nice clean bias tape that lays flat and doesn't want to flip up or flip over while you're wearing it. Now, using that second press line as a guide, we want to fold the bias tape down by 3/8 of an inch from the raw edge toward the wrong side and press as needed. This fold will cover and match the seam allowance that we just sewed. You can also trim any seams that are a little bit bulky, maybe at your shoulder seam, or if you're using a bulkier fabric, you can trim down that seam allowance so the fold is a little bit smoother and reduces any bulk in your bias tape. So go ahead and fold that over at the press line, about 3/8 of an inch, and press it down in place. You can take extra care with your extension flap so that it is nice and neat, because this will show a little bit on the front of your garment. Then, once it's pressed, you will go ahead and fold again, another 3/8 of an inch toward the wrong side. You'll work around the neckline, pinning and pressing as you go. And now the bias tape will be on the inside of the garment and not visible from the right side. Now is a good time to add a garment label if you want to do that. To find the center point, you can match the shoulder seams and put a little pin in the center where they meet. And then you can take your garment label and fold it in half as well to create a little crease, and you will match that to that back center that you just marked. Then go ahead and pin your garment label in place. Pin or clip all along the neckline to keep your bias tape in place. You will sew with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance along the folded edge of your bias tape. Now you have a finished bodice with bias tape. Go ahead and press any seams that need pressing and tie your ties. For view B of your top with the buttonholes, let's go ahead and sew the buttonholes and the buttons. So using the buttonhole placement guide as a template, mark your buttonholes on the right side of your bodice as it is worn. To mark your buttonholes, you can fold your buttonhole guide in half and then mark the bottom of where the buttonhole hits. Since most machines start a buttonhole at the bottom, this is the best place to put your mark. We will also place a pin in that bottom mark. You can measure to make sure it is centered within your buttonhole placket. We always suggest doing a test buttonhole on the same fabric. For your top buttonhole, it's also a good idea to use a hammer or anything you have lying around to pound that down since it is a bit thicker. Go ahead and follow the instructions for your sewing machine to create your buttonholes. Yay! Now we have 4 really nice buttonholes that are placed perfectly. You can go ahead and open up your buttonholes with a seam ripper or with small embroidery scissors. We also suggest putting a pin at the end so that you don't accidentally rip through and open up your buttonhole wider than you wanted. Now with the right button placket over the left button placket, find the center of the buttonholes and mark it. It's helpful to use a glue stick to temporarily baste your buttons on so they're not wiggling around when you're trying to sew. You can either sew these buttonholes on with your machine if it has that capability, or hand sew. Yay! If you are making view B with the button placket, your top is complete. We are now ready to move on to the pants. See you in the next step. All right, now let's work on the pants and shorts. You have 2 sets of mirrored pockets cut out. We are going to finish the outer and bottom curved edge of all 4 of the pocket bags with a zigzag stitch or a serger. If you are using a serger, you can go ahead and lift up your presser foot when you get to a curve to create a neater finish. Now we have 4 finished pocket bags. With the right sides together, we are going to pin the pocket bag to the front legs, matching at the notches. Do the same thing with the mirrored pocket for the other front leg. Now we're going to sew with a scant 1/2 inch seam allowance along the edge of the pocket opening. Scant just means a little bit less than 1/2 inch. Make sure you sew all the way through the end of the pocket and to where the pants are. Go ahead and finish the entire side seam going through all the layers with a zigzag stitch or a serger. With the right sides facing up, you're going to press the pocket and the seam allowance away from the pant leg. Then we're going to understitch the pocket with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, sewing through all the layers. Understitching helps the pocket naturally open and roll towards the side of the pants, and it reduces the chance of the pocket peeking out while you're wearing it. You'll do this for all the front pockets. Now we will sew the side seams and the inseams. With the right sides together, align the front and the back pant legs and match at the side seams. You'll pin in place and make sure the bottom of your pockets are lining up and pin there as well. Then, starting at the outer edge of the pocket, you'll sew around the pocket bag, pivot at the side seam where the pocket joins the pants, and then continue sewing down the side seam to the hem. And you're going to do this all with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Go slow on the curves of your pocket so you have a nice smooth pocket. Keep your stitch line going until you sew through the original stitch line that you made to sew the pocket onto your pant leg. Once you get to that stitch line, or 1 stitch past, you will pick up your foot with your needle down and pivot the pant so that you can continue sewing down the outseam of your pant leg. Now, starting at the waistband, sew down to the first notch using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. This will sew through the seam allowances of the pocket as well until you reach the first notch. You want to back stitch several times to secure the end of this stitch, making sure that your pocket will stay in place even if you have something heavy. Now you'll press the pocket and the seam allowance toward the front pant leg. With the pocket facing forward, go ahead and find the bottom of your pocket and place a pin. You can add a bar tack right at this pin or do a few back and forth stitches to keep your pocket from moving. This creates a really nice clean pocket that stays in place while you're wearing it. Now we will baste the top edge of the pocket to the front of the pant leg. Pin it in place and baste to keep it in place temporarily for the next steps. Sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now let's sew the inseam. With the right sides together, align the front and the back pant legs at the inseams. You'll pin in place all the way down the inseam and sew it with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. After you've sewn your 1/2 inch seam allowance, finish it with a zigzag stitch or a serger, and then press your seams towards the back pant leg. To connect your leg panels, you will turn one leg inside out while keeping the other leg right side out. We're gonna slide the leg that is right side out into the leg that's inside out. So now the right sides will be touching. We're going to align the front and back rise, matching at the crotch point. It's easiest to start your pinning at the crotch seam. You want to make sure that your double notches on the back rise match up. Now that it's pinned, we will sew all along the crotch seam with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then we will finish the seam with a zigzag stitch or a serger, and we'll press the seam to one side. Now let's work on the waistband. You are going to fold the top raw edge of the waistband down by 1/2 inch towards the wrong side of the fabric and press it in place. Press along the entire top edge of the waistband. Then you're going to fold again by another 1 3/4 inches towards the wrong side of the fabric, covering up the top edge of the pockets by at least 1/2 inch. It's helpful to pin at your center back seam first. You can measure along the way to make sure that you are maintaining your 1 3/4 inch fold. It's also helpful to mark about 2 inches away from your center back seam because we are going to be leaving an opening there to slide in our elastic. Now you're going to edge stitch along the bottom fold, leaving about a 4-inch opening at the center back, forming the channel for the elastic. This pattern uses 1 1/2 inch elastic. You can measure your elastic on your own body with about a 1/2 inch overlap. And again, we like to mark the top side of the elastic with a mark on either end so that we know it's not twisted when it comes together through the opening. Then you'll attach a safety pin to one end of your elastic and glide it through your elastic channel. Then you'll overlap the ends of your elastic by about 1/2 inch to 1 inch, pin it in place, and secure it with several back stitches on your sewing machine. We like to sew a square, back stitching at several end points to make sure it's really secure. Now, if you want to add a tag, it's a good time to do it. You just pin it into the center back seam, and you can edge stitch the opening for the elastic closed. Make sure to back stitch on this step as well. And if you need to, you can remove any visible basting stitches from the front pocket area. Your pockets will now be secured to your waistband with straight stitches down the front center and back center seams, as well as the side seams of your pants, to make sure your elastic stays in place. The step is optional, but it's helpful if you have elastic that tends to shift or fold over when you're wearing it. Now let's prepare and attach our ruffle cuff on our pants. You can see the front piece is a little bit shorter than the back piece, so make sure you are pairing the correct pieces together. With the right sides facing together, you'll sew the short ends of the front and back cuff with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Finish the seam with a zigzag stitch or a serger and press the seam towards the back. On your ruffle, you have a notched side and an unnotched side. To create your baby hem, you will do the same steps that we did in step 7A. You are going to press your cuff towards the wrong side by 1/8 of an inch on the unnotched side. Go ahead and press all the way around your pant ruffle. We will now sew with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance away from the folded edge. Try to get as close to the folded edge as you can. Next, you will trim away any seam allowance as close to that stitch line that we just made. Then you will fold the folded edge up another 3/8 of an inch along the first stitch line that we made. Press that folded edge up, and then you will sew with another 1/8 of an inch seam allowance as close to the folded edge as you can get. This is going to create a baby hem or a rolled hem. It's helpful to use pins at this point to mark the front center and back center of your cuff. To gather our ruffle, we're going to sew 2 rows of basting stitches along the upper raw edge. You can see step 7A for detailed instructions. Go ahead and gather those stitches that we made. It's helpful to press your gathers so that they stay in place and they're easier to maneuver when you're attaching them to your cuff. Here we are just making a center front and a center back notch on our pant leg so that we can align our cuff. So with the right sides together, we are going to align the raw edge of the ruffle with the bottom raw edge of the leg, matching at the side seams and matching at the center front and center back notches that we just made. Distribute your gathers evenly along the edge of your pant leg and pin in place. Now we'll sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance right in between those 2 rows of basting stitches that you made for your gathers. It's helpful to sew with your gather side up to make sure everything is nice and neat and that your gathers stay distributed evenly. Then you'll finish that seam with a zigzag stitch or a serger. Remove any visible basting stitches and press your seam toward the leg. This is optional, but you can top stitch your seam allowance down on the leg side so that it doesn't flip while you're wearing it or during any washing. Make sure to catch all the seam allowances underneath. And repeat all these steps for the other leg. Yay, your pants are complete. Now you have a full ruffle brunch set.
Thank
thank you so much for watching our sewing tutorial and for sewing the ruffle brunch set with us. We hope you love it as much as we do, and we can't wait to see all of your makes. Tag us at Matchy Matchy Sewing Club on Instagram and follow us on YouTube for more sewing tutorials. Happy sewing!